All right.
Thank you, Sasha. And so, hello to everyone. Welcome to Health Matters, a virtual lecture series on medicine, illness, and public health. I'm Melissa Miller. I'm an assistant professor at Colby College up in Maine. We would first off like to thank the Jordan Center for sponsoring this series, as well as to Sasha Shpetalnik for her technical expertise. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Elena Pedigo Clark, who will be speaking on trauma and truth, PTSD, trauma theory, and literature on the Chechen Wars. Elena Pedigo Clark is an associate professor of Russian at Wake Forest University. Her research focuses on literary form, Russian identity formation vis-a-vis the Russian periphery, and contemporary war literature. She has published multiple articles on these topics, and her book, Trauma and Truth, Teaching Russian Literature on the Chechen Wars, was released in 2023 by Academic Studies Press. It received the 2024 AtSeal Best Book in Pedagogy Award. And so I momentarily will turn things over to Yelena, but I wanted to say the structure. First off, Yelena will talk for around 50 minutes to an hour or so, and then we'll open things up. We'll have about a half an hour for questions. So if you'll hold your questions until the end, and then we have such a large group today. I think everyone, it would be great if people could put their questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll relay the questions to Yelena. So thank you, Elena, so much for being here. We're really excited about your talk. And when you're ready, please do begin.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I have a PowerPoint and I'm going to attempt to share it. Let's do slideshow. Hang on. Wait, slideshow, come back. Play from start. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Are we good? All right, thanks so much. So I have a lot to say, so I will jump into it. Let me know if I'm talking too fast and you can't understand me. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming here to hear my talk on Trauma and Truth, this book that came out in 2023. And like a lot of things, this book is both personal and political. So I got the idea for various reasons, but as I was saying, as we were starting out, like my family went the opposite way. We moved from America to Russia in the early 90s. I was actually in Russia throughout pretty much the whole first Chechen War. I went back to Moscow to do a study abroad during the second Chechen War. So I was there. It was happening while I was there. I was very far away from the war zone. So I was not direct, I didn't directly experience it, but I was very much aware that it was a thing that was happening. And so it was much more on my consciousness than perhaps these wars were for most Americans. And then when I was doing my PhD at UNC, one of the authors I profile here, Arkady Babchenko, came and did some readings. And so I met him and attended the readings and started assigning his book, One Soldier's War, to my students. And here at Wake Forest, I had students who were taking military science classes and studying the Chechen Wars. They wanted more information about literature on and about the Chechen Wars, and I started looking into it, and I discovered that there just wasn't very much at all. And I thought someone should write something, and I guess that someone should be me. So there's one part of the background. And then the other thing that was going on as I started working on this book was that I myself was developing a devastating but mysterious illness. And I'm sure you will not be shocked to hear that after many years of going to doctors and being told I wasn't ill, but getting sicker and sicker and sicker, it turned out that I had Lyme disease, plus various complications relating to that. But that experience, to me was very traumatizing, as it often is, and I felt emotionally akin to these traumatized veterans that I was researching and profiling. I had this experience of having a traumatic event that cut me off from society. I felt abandoned by both God and man in a way, and lost my faith in the system, and so on and so forth. And so I had this thing that emotionally I felt very connected to them in a way that I didn't with a lot of the rest of society. And so for me, I guess you could say this was a kind of a cathartic healing experience in the way that writing about wars or writing about other things was for the veterans that I profile. So that's some of the background, and I'll jump into a little bit more about the project. Oh, wait, oh, there, buttons there. Um, apparently I have to use my mouse, not my keyboard, to forward the slide now. So why talk about Chechen War literature? As I mentioned, it's understudied. There's not a huge amount of scholarship, especially English language scholarship in it. And as I argue in the book, I think it provides this really good insight into the collective psyche of post-Soviet society and post-Soviet society in general. But of course, as I was working on this, there was the war in the Donbass and then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And I think that the Chechen Wars and Chechen war literature provides some really interesting insights into deep motivations behind what's going on with those wars. Maybe not very happy insights, but I think important insights to keep in mind. I also argue that the Chechen Wars were part of the overall global war on terror. And the English language war writer Elliot Ackerman says that the countries involved in the global war on terror and the aftermath and the kind of cultural and social fragmentation and kind of disintegration, you might say, that we're seeing as an aftermath partially of the global war on terror, these countries could really use a work of art that tells us something about ourselves. And he's talking about America there, but I think that the same could very much be said about Russia. And fortunately, Russia and the Russophone world, because one thing we could talk about is how are the authors I profile even Russian? Like what does Russian literature mean at this point? That the Russophone world has this deep literary tradition and this tradition of war writing that really stands it in good stead. And they do have works of art that can really tell them something about themselves here. So that's a little bit of background about why I thought this was important. I said I thought that the Chechen Wars are part of the overall global war on terror, and I wanted to give a quick overview of features of the global war on terror that are important, I think, for understanding the social and psychological factors that veterans of the global war on terror experience. And I'm particularly talking about the veterans who were representing the great powers. So the US, the UK, Russia, sort of the
Think maybe we lost Elena.
Afghanistan or someplace like that. But for Russia as well, Chechnya is part of Russia, but it's a distant part of Russia. You know, like I said, I was living in Russia when the first Chechen War broke out, but it was really, really far away. Like it hardly affected us at all, even though technically it was happening in the country we were living in. So there's this very distant battlefield. It feels really far away. It doesn't have a lot of direct effect or relevance to the civilians back home. So this heightens this disconnect between veterans and then the civilians back home. The global war on terror featured a lot of professional or volunteer military forces. Of course, Western forces largely volunteer or professional. The US military is entirely volunteer professional military. And we do that for a reason, like there's a reason that we have that. But what this has led to is what American war writer Brian Van Riet calls a samurai class that fights the wars. So again, we have this special military class, and you have military families where lots of people serve, and then hardly anybody outside of that serves. Or a lot of working class people who use the military as a way to get out of poverty or whatever, but not a lot of people of the upper classes necessarily. So we have, again, this disconnect between the people doing the fighting and the general civilian populace back home. And so the general civilian populace just doesn't have a lot of skin in the game. Russian forces, of course, included and still include draftees. They have a draft, but a lot of the fighting was done by contract soldiers and is done by contract soldiers. And so again, there's this feeling of these people who are volunteering to do this and they're doing it for money. So you have like these people out there doing it for money, and the rest of us can kind of wash our hands of it, of what they're doing. They don't necessarily represent us. Another feature of the global war on terror is this asymmetrical battlefield, meaning you have conventional forces representing the great powers and then insurgents. And what this means is that you don't necessarily know even where the battlefield is, right? Like it's not like, okay, we're both going to meet at Bosworth Field or whatever and whack each other with swords until one side declares victory and the other side declares defeat. You're just driving along peacefully and all of a sudden you get blown up by an IED or like vaporized by a mine or something like that. So there's this constant uncertainty over even where the battlefield is. Your foe might not wear a conventional uniform or use conventional weapons, so you don't know who is friend and who is foe. And so this is you're in a state of particular anxiety and uncertainty. And as I was working on this, I posited, and a number of the veterans that I talked to posited, that this caused a particular kind of trauma or PTSD. And I still think it can cause a particular kind of trauma or PTSD. It was clearly very traumatic, and many people experienced severe PTSD afterwards, including lots of people in non-combat roles. And at the same time, I've been paying attention to reports, stories coming in from U.S. veterans of the global war on terror who have volunteered to fight in Ukraine on the Kiev side. And a lot of what they're reporting is that the symmetrical battlefield is even worse. That when you're facing Russian artillery and gunships and things like that, it's just mind-meltingly awful, even worse than the asymmetrical battlefield in any way. And a lot of these people have just left because they can't handle the horror of the symmetrical battlefield that's currently going on in Ukraine. So that's kind of changed my view a little bit, but nonetheless, the asymmetrical battlefield causes severe anxiety and uncertainty and a lack of ability to know what's going on and where you are and who is friend and who is foe. So that's the global war on terror. And as I looked at my texts, I based my analysis heavily on trauma theory, both trauma theory as kind of a medical or psychological term, and then the literature of trauma. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the psychology of trauma and a key medical text about it, and then turn to literary theory. And one of my key kind of psychological medical text was Judith Herman's classic Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror. And I just got a thing saying my internet connection is unstable. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
We
Okay.
can hear you now, but you did cut out for a few seconds there, like 30 seconds to a minute earlier, just so you know. But so far, you're sounding clear.
Okay, great. Sorry. So, well, I'm talking about Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror. And she describes three main features of PTSD, which you'll probably be familiar with. The first she talks about is hyperarousal, or the persistent expectation of danger. Which is, when you're flooded with adrenaline or cortisol or whatever, and your perceptions are super heightened, which is something that the authors I profile talk a lot about. And you can have this kind of godlike feeling that you know everything that's happening, and then it can kind of collapse into just total panic. The second thing she talks about is intrusion, or the indelible imprint of the traumatic moment, where you keep remembering the traumatic moment over and over again. These are the classic PTSD flashbacks, which is another feature of the text that I profile. And then constriction, or the numbing response of surrender, where you just kind of shut down and you stop feeling your feelings and you go numb and maybe even kind of catatonic, which again is something I think you see in the texts that I profile. And she also talks a lot about how trauma affects memory. And this is one of the things that actually first drew me to the text, was their fragmented nonlinear form. And she argues that traumatic memories are not encoded like the ordinary memories of adults in verbal linear narrative that is assimilated into an ongoing life story, but rather they are encoded in the form of vivid sensations and images. So if you've ever had a really traumatic, frightening experience, like a car crash or something, you might have a couple of really vivid images of the event, but also these kind of periods of blackout, or you can't remember what happened first and what happened next. So there are these incredibly vivid memories that might keep intruding into your consciousness over and over again, but they're not necessarily linear or verbal. You can't necessarily describe what happened or the order that things happened in. And that's, again, something that I see in the form itself of all the texts. And she also talks about how trauma affects relationships. She says that trauma impels people both to withdraw from close relationships and to seek them desperately. The traumatized person, therefore, frequently alternates between isolation and anxious clinging to others. And again, I say that this is something that the authors describe explicitly. They say, I really, really, really want to tell you what it was like, but you can never understand. And at the same time, the texts themselves are kind of an example of how they try to reach out and cling to others, and then think that they can't, and they pull back, and then they try again. And so you have this kind of back and forth dance of trying and failing. So again, like I said, I see that. I argue that those are features in the form of the text themselves, and that the authors also describe in the texts. And then as far as literary theory, one of the key texts that I use to base my literary theory on was Kali Tal's Worlds of Hurt, Reading the Literatures of Trauma. And she argues that the identity of the author is the distinguishing feature of the literature of trauma. So anyone could write a book about the Chechen Wars, and it could be a perfectly good book, but it's only the literature of trauma if you were traumatized by direct experience and you're writing about that trauma in some way. So for example, Vladimir Makanin wrote several stories about the Chechen Wars, somewhat controversially, and they received a lot of critical acclaim, and they are very good. But he himself was not a direct participant in the wars, and so he's gotten some pushback of like he shouldn't have done that. There's this whole combat Gnosticism thing in war writing, in both Anglophone and Russophone war writing. And that's a whole interesting thing that we could discuss later, perhaps. But for my purposes, I decided to focus on the literature of trauma and to focus on authors who have had direct experience of the Chechen Wars. And she also says that the literature of trauma is written from the need to tell and retell the story of the traumatic experience, to make it real to both the victim and the community. And this is something that the authors are very explicit that they're trying to do in these works, that they're trying to heal themselves, and they're also trying to bear witness to their community. And so they're doing this kind of double thing of healing themselves and healing their community and telling the story, even though they're not sure that other people can understand their story. Another important thing that Kali Tal talks about is the difference between combat veterans and other trauma survivors. And she says the soldier in combat is both victim and victimizer, dealing death as well as risking it. These soldiers carry guns, they point them at people and shoot to kill. Members of oppressed groups, by contrast, almost never control the tools of violence. And I include a civilian, Anna Politkovskaya, as well as combatants. So like obviously her experience is different from that of combatants. But this is really something to bear in mind, especially for the Russian combatants, Babchenko and Prilepin, whom I profile, that they are they're victims and they're also victimizers. They're out there shooting to kill. They're, representing a fairly repressive force that's trying to forcibly assimilate this region back into their country. And so they have this kind of double trauma in a way, because it's very traumatic to have violence or harm inflicted upon you, but it's also very traumatic to inflict violence or harm on someone else. And so combat veterans have this double trauma that they experience that's very ambiguous, and that they often have much more ambivalent feelings about their trauma because they are both victims and victimizers. And just really quickly, I'm sure everyone knows where the Caucasus is, but just in case there's someone who doesn't or just needs a quick refresher, it's this mountainous isthmus here between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, very diverse because it's so mountainous. So you have all these little valleys and little regions with different languages and ethnic groups and religions. And it's also the meeting place of three empires. We have the Russian, the historical Russian Empire up here, the Ottoman Empire over here, and then the Persian Empire over here. And as Russia was moving south in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were pacifying the local tribes and pushing the Ottoman and Persian empires out of the region, basically. So it's this region that's seen a huge amount of conflict and is kind of known for conflict and conquest. And it was assimilated forcibly into the Russian Empire in the 19th century, and then became part of the Soviet system, the Soviet Union, which had both, as for the rest of the Soviet Union, both benefits and problems. There was a lot of harsh repression. Chechnya in particular experienced very harsh repression under Stalin, but also potential benefits such as literacy, modern education, and access to this wider world that in many ways it's very beneficial to be part of an empire, right? Even if you're forcibly brought into it. So this whole region has this, again, very conflict and conquest heavy history, and this very, shall we say, ambiguous or ambivalent relationship to it. Post-Soviet Chechnya, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the South Caucasian republics, which were independent, they were republics of the Soviet Union, so they achieved independence. Chechnya also wanted independence, but it was not a Soviet socialist republic. It was part of Russia. And so it did not have the legal right to independence that, for example, Armenia did, according to the terms of dissolution of the USSR. But they decided to declare independence anyway. And it was de facto kind of independent from 1991 to 1994. In the end of 1994, Russia launched an attack to bring it back under control. They wanted to have what they called a short victorious war. That is not what happened. The war was very unpopular in Russia. The Chechens put up a surprisingly stiff resistance. At the time, there was considerable freedom of the press, and people were reading about what was happening back home in Russia and going like, oh my God, we don't want to be involved in this. And it ended in 1996 with de facto independence for Chechnya. But sadly, Chechnya did not use its independence wisely. There was all this corruption and infighting. And then we had the Second Chechen War following Chechen militants invading Dagestan in August 1999, this wave of apartment buildings in the fall of 1999, highly controversial topic. And then the Battle of Grozny happened 1999 to 2000. That was the main sort of conventional war aspect to the Second Chechen War, at the end of which Grozny was declared the most destroyed city on earth. And it was compared to Stalingrad at the end of World War II, that there was horrendous destruction. This was followed by about a decade of insurgency and terrorist attacks, and coincided with growing restrictions on freedom of the press in the Russian Federation. And all of these things together, plus the fact that this was seen as part of the global war on terror, meant that there was a lot less support for the Chechen resistance, both in Russia and in the West. And ultimately, Chechnya was brought back firmly into the fold, and they're part of the Russian Federation now. And Ramzan Kadyrov, as we know, is one of Putin's right-hand men. So that was all background. And now I'm going to jump into talking about the 4 authors and the 4 works whom I profile. And I wanted all authors who had direct experience of the Chechen Wars, but I also wanted a diverse mix of authors, so civilians, combatants, women, men, Chechens, Russians, and so they're kind of a bit of a motley group, but they all have direct experience of the Chechen Wars. And the first one that I talk about is Anna Politkovskaya. I'm sure most of you are familiar with her. She was actually born in New York to Ukrainian parents. They were at the UN at the time, spent a lot of her life in Moscow. So again, we have this question of like, what is Russian literature? She was a journalist writing in Russian, basically considered herself to be Russian, but was of Ukrainian heritage, born in New York. And she was a journalist for Novaya Gazeta, originally covered sort of social and children's issues, ended up covering the Second Chechen War, and gained notoriety for her fiery critique of the war, but she approaches it very much from a civilian perspective, and focuses a lot on the stories of women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. So that really sets her apart from most other writing about these wars, and war in general, which focuses a lot on combatants and not on non-combatants. She was much more interested in the experience of non-combatants. And then again, as I'm sure we all know, she was assassinated on October 7th, 2006, in what was clearly a contract killing. There were 2 trials. The people who carried out the contract killing were sentenced at the second trial. They all had relations to Chechen security services, and she was researching allegations of torture by Chechen security services at the time of her killing, but they didn't say who ordered the hit. And then the person who organized it died in prison, so we may never know for sure. I'm sure some names come to mind, but officially we don't know. And she, of course, has received many, many death threats. So I focus mainly on her first work on the Second Chechen War, which is A Dirty War. And as you might guess from the name, she focuses a lot on government corruption. Sorry, got to depollinate. And the pollenocalypse is happening down here in South Carolina or North Carolina, and I got to clear the pollen out of my throat. But this dirty war, she calls it a dirty war, and her second book was A Small Corner of Hell. So this is like a dirty war and it's hell. And she focuses a lot on government corruption and callousness. And she has a lot of metaphors in her writing about the Second Chechen War, describing it as a sickness, as gangrene, as cancer, as a toxin, as poison. She very much sees it as this thing that is destroying Russia from the inside, as a sickness. And I argue that she also demonstrates a feminine ethics of care, which she differentiates from the masculine world she is confronting. So of course, war is sort of like the most masculine thing you can do. And she's a woman and a civilian writing mainly about women's and children's issues at the war. And she very much, I argue, represents this what's called a feminine ethics of care as opposed to a masculine ethics of rights. Most democracies and semi-democracies have this masculine ethics of rights, and she's arguing for something different, and arguing for a sort of a more maternal relationship to the people, and criticizes the Russian government for basically being a bad mother and failing its sons. And I argue that she very much engages in bearing witness and telling and retelling, not so much of her own trauma, although she did experience many traumatic things like, a mock execution by Russian forces and all kinds of stuff like that. But she's much more interested in telling other people's stories. And she's really interested in telling the story of what's happening to Russia because of the Second Chechen War. And the book itself is all the series of essays. It's kind of in chronological order, but you don't really see a lot of chronological, the chronology is not really important. What's important is all these vivid emotional scenes that she depicts. And so I argue, as I say here, that her short, disconnected vignettes of other people's lives demonstrate a kind of national PTSD. So that I say that in both what she's describing and how she describes it, she's demonstrating the national experience of PTSD as a result of the Second Chechen War. So that's Politkovskaya. And then to continue our question of like, what is Russian literature? The next author whom I talk about is Mikhail Eldin, and I've actually got him on text on Signal here. So if anyone has questions for him, he doesn't speak English, so he's not on the call. But if anyone wants to pass on a question, he said he's on standby. He's na связи. He's here to answer questions if anyone wants to hear from him directly. And he's also a journalist, so all four authors started off as journalists. He started his writing career for Vast, or Image, a local Chechen language newspaper in Grozny, and he was actually doing arts and culture. But he was there, he witnessed the initial attack by Russian federal forces in 1994. And he became sort of more and more involved in the Chechen resistance, first as a journalist and kind of a press officer, and then as a combatant. And he's currently actually a political refugee in Norway. So he's basically in exile from Russia and Chechnya. And as we'll discuss in relation to his memoir that I talk about, The Sky Wept Fire, again, like I'm calling this Russian literature, but we can ask ourselves, what is Russian literature? He's Chechen, engaged in an attempt to gain Chechen independence from Russia. He wrote the book in Russian, but it's only been published in English. So like, what is this? What is this? I'm lumping it in with sort of Russian or Russophone literature. It's got all these ties to Tolstoy and things like that, but what is this? Is it Russian literature? Is it Chechen literature? Is it English literature? Discuss kind of thing. It received a fair amount of critical acclaim when it was released, received a PEN Award, and I think is a really good look at the experience of PTSD. He very much focuses on impressions and experiences. And he says at the beginning that he has this quote unquote strange memory, and he can't remember concrete details very well. And he was captured and tortured by Russian federal forces, and had significant memory loss and brain damage as a result. So he has like actual brain damage as well as trauma. And it's very much apparent in both what he describes and how he describes it. There are all these hallucinatory, fragmented scenes in which he very explicitly demonstrates both hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction. He also dissociates during combat and especially torture, and switches pronouns from I. So he's saying like, I did this, I did that. He switches from I to you during the torture scenes. And he said that he, it was like he was looking, when he started writing about it, it was like he was looking at someone else from afar, someone naive, he said like young, naive, and stupid, and was watching this young, naive, stupid person from afar. It didn't feel like him. It feels like a completely different person. And the book really chronicles this transformation from a young, naive, idealistic person to someone who's been really traumatized by war and combat. At the same time, he also sometimes switches into we during combat scenes, like he becomes part of the unit, like they become one, they all become one, which is another experience that combat veterans frequently describe. And it's also very clearly the literature of trauma, and he's very much driven by the need to bear witness and tell and retell, both for his experience and the Chechen people's experience. So again, it's not what I'd call an easy read, either structurally or content-wise, emotionally, but I have assigned it to my classes, and they do find it a riveting read. And it's very much worthwhile, both if you're interested in writing about the Chechen Wars, especially from the Chechen perspective, and just this experience of PTSD in general, because it's very much you're sort of in his mind what he's experiencing. So those were the first two sort of like more friendly authors, I would say, for us to deal with. And now things are going to get wild. Now we're going to deal with some less friendly authors, less friendly to Western scholars, perhaps. And the first one that I'm going to talk about, you may very well know who he is, Arkady Babchenko, and he's the one, like, I did meet him. He came to the UNC campus, and the grad students were told, like, you guys got to take him out to dinner and show him a good time, but don't let him drink because he's got really bad PTSD, and if he drinks, it'll be a problem. We showed up to meet him the first night, he was already drinking. I was like, oh no, now what? So it was a colorful visit, but nonetheless productive. As you can see from his name, he's partially of Ukrainian heritage, something that's very important in his current political work. But he's originally from Moscow, and he studied law. And he was conscripted during the first Chechen War. He actually volunteered to go to Chechnya. He wanted to. He had been reading Remarque, stuff like All Quiet on the Western Front, and thought, I want to have some kind of awesome experience like that too. And so he volunteered, but he says it doesn't matter because they sent everyone in his unit anyway, regardless of whether they volunteered or not. So he served as a conscript during the first Chechen War, demobilized, went back, finished law school, and then the second Chechen War broke out, and he volunteered as a contract soldier. And he can't really explain why, but other than his adrenaline dependency, which is something we'll talk about more when I talk about his book. But after he demobilized, then he became a journalist, and a war correspondent, was magnetically attracted to war, had to keep going back to war zones until he appears to have been cured of that. He was in the Donbass during the war in the Donbass, and he, by that time, was fairly opposed to the Russian government, and he was pro the post-Maidan Ukrainian government. So he was there writing like sympathetic articles about the post-Maidan Kiev government and the post-Maidan Kiev government forces. But then he was captured by some Ukrainian forces, and they didn't believe that he was on their side, and he was tortured and subjected to a mock execution. And after that, apparently he lost interest in going into actual war zones, or he says he lost his nerve. He became too afraid to do it. Nonetheless, he continued to support the post-Maidan Kiev government. And after a particularly inflammatory Facebook post, there was a giant brouhaha, and he had to flee Russia for his life. And he ended up in Ukraine in 2017. There was a whole dramatic faked death thing in 2018, which I'm sure some of you remember, where there was this report with pictures of him covered in blood that he'd been assassinated in a contract killing. And then the next day they had a press conference, and out he popped, live is live. This is a picture of him from the press conference. And it turned out it was all a sting operation. So that was exciting. And that was happening just as I was working on the book. I honestly thought he'd been killed. I and the students who'd been sort of helping me out with this were completely devastated and then completely enraged when he came back to life. He's got some kind of beef with Zelensky, however. I'm not sure what it is, but he left Ukraine in a huff following Zelensky's election, is currently in Estonia, I think, according to his Twitter profile anyway. And if you want to go have a good laugh, check out his Twitter profile. It's Starshina Zapas. And it says he's in Tallinn, and despite his blood feud with Zelensky, he's continuing to raise money on social media for Ukrainian forces. So an extremely colorful character. And very politically active, but in kind of like in interesting ways, shall we say, and not necessarily friendly or easy to work with ways. That being said, his work, One Soldier's War, his book is probably one of the best memoirs about war that I've encountered, and I've talked to a number of American veterans who've read it as well. As you can see, it got all kinds of critical acclaim, including this blurb on the front from Mark Bowden, the author of Black Hawk Down. And I've talked to various American veterans who've read it and says that he touched on something about the war experience that's just so deep and so true and so real, that you just sort of can't have a better book describing the experience of war, basically. And it involves both these like journalistic pieces that he did as a journalist, but also these short stories that he wrote after he was demobilized. And some of them were initially published as short stories featuring a protagonist with a different name, but that was similar, like Artyom Babitsky or something like that. And so they were packaged as short stories, and then they were repackaged into the book as a memoir. So some of the stuff is journalistic and some of it is maybe a bit more fictionalized, but they're all based basically on his experiences. And it's very much this typical war story, descent into the underworld, but also very much a subversion of that typical war story. Again, it's a series of fragmentary essays and pieces that's not real necessarily in chronological order. So it's pretty hard to tell like what, like where he is, when he is, what's happening first, what's happening next. Is all about the image and the moment. So very much this kind of these fragmented nonlinear memories. He describes in great detail his adrenaline dependency and his war addiction, and what Herman calls this need to recreate the moment of terror. So a lot of trauma victims will try to recreate their trauma, thinking like, this time around, I'll get it under control, I'll stop it from happening. Well, of course, it doesn't happen for him. Like he keeps going back into war zones and they just keep being terrible. And ultimately, of course, he had this absolutely horrendous experience that was what finally stopped him going into war zones, although he still very much identifies himself as someone with a close tie to war zones. He also very clearly depicts and talks about this clinging together of combat units and this alternation between isolation and anxious clinging to others. There's, of course, hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction, the nonlinear memories that I mentioned, and then what Herman calls the special status as an initiate in the cult of war. So something that Herman talks a lot about is how trauma victims often feel like they've been singled out and they've been made special by their traumatic experience. And this is particularly the case for combat veterans, for a variety of reasons. But obviously, if you are sent into combat, you're probably part of a small group anyway. You're the tip of the spear. It's normally young, healthy young men. So it's this very small group. There's also a lot of issues with like groups of young men, and that's a whole other problematic issue. But here we have a double thing, groups of young men who are undergoing intense trauma, and they very much tend to see themselves as having this very special status in this kind of cult that no one else can join. There's also this transformation from a naive victim to this hardened warrior and even perhaps a perpetrator of hazing and abuse. And then these explicit descriptions of suicidal tendencies, PTSD, and what the author Dominic Lecapra calls traumatropism, or this unwillingness to give up on grieving and nightmares and flashbacks. First of all, because having them is essential to your founding trauma as myth of origin. So if you identify as a traumatized combat veteran, then you can't give up on your trauma because it's central to your concept of who you are. And second of all, it's your way of remaining connected to the people who were killed. And he describes this very clearly in some of the works, how he has nightmares of his best friend who was killed, but he can't give up on the nightmares because that would mean giving up on his connection to his best friend, and he just wants to die instead. He just wants to join his friend in death. So overall, this is an extremely challenging read, both structurally and emotionally, but very powerful. My students normally react to it very strongly, often positively, although I think it's important to prepare students for reading something like that. And like I said, veterans say it really touches on an experience of war in a way that a lot of other works just can't. It really does a deep dive into what it's like to be in combat. And so I rarely recommend it. I do really recommend it, but I'd say approach with caution, basically. And then the last author that I talk about is less famous in the West, but more famous in Russia, and that's Zakhar Prilyapin. And he's one of the more popular and well-known authors in Russia. Of course, Zakhar Prilyapin is his pen name / military call sign. His actual name is Yevgeny Prilyapin, originally from Ryazan, and then moved to the Nizhny Novgorod region. And like I said, very popular, lots of critical acclaim. He's been called the Gorky of our time, and one of the founding authors of modern war prose, and probably the most important author of contemporary Russian war prose. And his writing is really, it tends to be semi-autobiographical and really based on his military experience. He served with the OMON in Chechnya in 1996 and Dagestan in 1999. After he demobilized, he became a journalist, and he also became associated with the National Bolsheviks, and engaged in all this kind of oppositional political activity, but kind of right-wing, red-brown, like, well, it's hard to call it right-wing because he's got this strong, like, socialist, communist aspect to it as well, but it's called this kind of red-brown political faction in Russia. He was initially pretty opposed to the Putin administration, but with the outbreak of war in the Donbass, he started collecting and bringing humanitarian aid to the Donbass, became involved in the separatists there, became a confidant with Zakharchenko, ended up financing and running a battalion for Donbass separatists, and as part of that, he shut down a lot of his opposition to the Putin administration, although if you look at what he does, he's by nature an oppositionist. That's who he is. He's just oppositional. But he does not criticize Putin anymore in public. And he wrote this incredibly interesting autobiographical novel, Некоторые не попадут в ад, Some Won't Go to Hell, about his experiences in the Donbass. Unfortunately, it's not translated into English, unlikely to be translated into English anytime soon, but very much worth reading, I think, if you can read it in the original Russian. And then after Zakharchenko was killed, Prilyapin went back to Russia, but then volunteered for the National Guard following the Russian invasion, served on the front in Ukraine with the Russian National Guard. When he was home on leave, he was targeted by a pro-Ukrainian group, which put a bomb in his car, and his driver was killed and he was badly injured. As far as I know, he's not been back to the front since then, but he was recently in North Korea, which is very interesting. I have not had time to read his blog posts about that, but he apparently was recently in North Korea and wrote these very complimentary things about North Korea. So that's interesting. So he's a really colorful character. He's very anti-Western, does not care for the West at all, very much a Russian patriot, even though he doesn't seem to care much for the Putin administration either. But when given a choice between the two, he's going to choose Russia over the West, regardless of who's in charge. As he told me when I asked him, a writer doesn't have a position, a writer has a motherland, and that's the most important thing, is the motherland as far as he's concerned. The novel that I talk about in my book is Pathology or Pathologies, which was his debut novel. Came out in 2005, shortlisted for the National Bestseller Prize. It's semi-autobiographical about a special forces soldier in Chechnya. And once again, it's non-linear. It's got these fragmented, interwoven storylines of his tour of duty in Chechnya, his breakup with his girlfriend Dasha, and then these traumatic childhood memories involving his dog Daisy. So once again, like in the text itself, in the form of the text itself, we experience these nonlinear memories that you get from trauma. He also writes very explicitly about the acute anxiety that he experiences prior to combat. And Prilepin's known as this really macho guy who creates macho protagonists, but a lot of his protagonists are very, very open about pre-combat anxiety. Although when they're actually in combat, then they seem to experience constriction and they just shut down and there's no emotions at all. But prior to combat, they're like beside themselves from terror practically. And you can see hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction throughout the story, as I say, including he has PTSD flashbacks of traumatic childhood memories in the midst of combat. So like combat is the kind of relaxing, healing thing for him in a way, and is interrupted by these PTSD flashbacks of stuff that happened to him as a child. So instead of like with Eldin and Babchenko, we have this movement from innocence to traumatized. Prilepin's protagonist Yegor comes in already traumatized, and combat is a way that he kind of pulls himself together, reclaims his memories, makes sense of his life, and heals himself through combat. So in a way, it's more uplifting, but also super concerning, right? Because he needs combat to heal himself from the trauma that he has experienced in civilian life. And the story ends with reconciliation with unit members whom he doesn't like, and this religious revelation based on the passage from Romans 8, in which he rescues a dog. So like he redeems himself from his previous dog-related traumas, following all these PTSD flashbacks about this dog-related trauma during the combat scenes in Grozny. It's a fascinating book. It's not translated into English, and like I said, and unlikely to be translated anytime soon because he's so hostile to the West. He's not the kind of person that we translate into English, but if you can read it, if you have students who can read it, I do really recommend it. He is a very powerful writer, and he gives this really interesting and important perspective, both on trauma and on contemporary Russian culture, that I think is really worth examining. So those are sort of my four authors, my four main works, and I'll wrap it up really quickly with some takeaways. I have some really depressing conclusions, and I hopefully some more uplifting conclusions. All four authors very explicitly war is hell. That it's just more awful than you can possibly imagine. It is absolutely hell on so many levels. All of them are traumatized both individually and collectively, and they produce these fragmented nonlinear narratives, and which you can see hyperarousal, intrusion, constriction, belief in the fullness of trauma and the cult of war. And this is particularly the case for Babchenko and Prilepin, but I think you can see other authors as well. Once you've had that experience of being traumatized, you know, you feel like you wear that mark forever. All four authors witness and tell a collective truth, but they have a really hard time doing so, that they're desperate to connect with their audience, but also either afraid of connecting with their audience or feel despair that they can't, like no one can understand what they've been through. They also often struggle to find nonviolent alternatives to war and political conflict. Sort of once you experience it, it's like you see everything through the lens of war. And again, this is particularly the case for Babchenko and Prilepin, who are now very publicly on opposite sides of the war in Ukraine, and have very publicly said that the only solution is total military victory over our opponents. And Prilepin is calling for, this won't end until we take Kiev. And Babchenko has said, the only way I'm going back to Russia is when I ride into Moscow on an Abrams tank, and I'm really looking forward to doing that. So they can't see a way out of this that doesn't involve war. On the other hand, the authors do achieve connection, catharsis, and healing, that the act of writing and bearing witness does provide them with purpose and healing. And I particularly talked to Eldon about this, and he said that writing was very cathartic and healing. He also talked about sport was very cathartic and healing. And we had this interesting conversation about how sports provide adrenaline and maybe sort of fill in that adrenaline dependency. And it seems to be very healing, especially martial arts. Politkovskaya, but she manages to achieve connection and trust with her Chechen subjects. She also witnesses all of these acts of mutual aid, person-to-person connection, and basically people helping each other out. So she witnesses all this corruption and callousness, but also all of this goodwill and help. Eldon, I talked about, and he also has this connection of nature, with nature, the divine, and with other warriors. So he also experiences a lot of connection with others. Bobchenko experiences connection with others as part of these huge mythic cycles, that there's a lot of sort of Greek mythology in the book. He said that was unconscious. He didn't mean to do that, but it's there. And he experiences a lot of connection with other soldiers and with these mythological cycles. And of course, he's connected with lots of others on social media about war experience. And then Prilepin's Yegor, the protagonist of Pathologies, also connects with those he initially despises through religious revelation and shared suffering and travail. And so I sort of come away with, I think you have to be careful reading war literature. And my next project is looking at how reading literature about war that's supposed to make you not want to go to war tends to make people want to make more war, and how this is a problem. So I think you have to dose it correctly. You have to treat it like a vaccine, where you just get a little dose in to kind of vaccinate yourself against it. However, literature in general does give us this mind-to-mind empathy. And these works that I include here give you an excellent sense of what it's like to be there. I'm sure it's not the same as actually being there, but it is an excellent sense of what it's like to be there. And that sense of what it's like to be there, that sense of what it's like to be a traumatized veteran or a traumatized victim of war, like I say, this empathy may be our best tool for avoiding conflict and healing trauma in the future. And I'll stop there. And I'll stop my screen share.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was absolutely fascinating. What I'd like to do now is open the floor up to questions from the audience. And so we do, like I said, have quite a large audience on a Zoom call. So if you wouldn't mind putting your question in the chat, and then I'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll relay the questions to Elena. So Elena, we had a question from earlier, and let me scroll back up to it. So one of our attendees asks, do you see non-pharmaceutical ways of treating PTSD, that have emerged in this research? Have you seen things that you would say for these authors and the people they write about is an effective tool against PTSD?
So I'll start this by saying, I'm a literary scholar, not a medical doctor. So I don't want to start prescribing things or saying like, don't take your meds. I would say consult with a medical professional about that. However, talking to these authors and to veterans, and I talked to a number of Western veterans as well as I was working on this book. A lot of them said that again, writing about it was the most helpful thing they could do. That and like manual labor or sports, and sort of working with your hands and being very present. But writing and sharing the story. Again, you sort of process it, you achieve connection with others. I'd say the interesting thing is that some people found it very helpful to write autobiography or memoir, and some people had to fictionalize it for it to have effect. And so we see this where Eldon, for example, he wrote a memoir that's very explicitly his memoir, although again he changes pronouns as he's talking about. He feels like he's talking about someone else. Prilepin, on the other hand, who never says that he has PTSD, but obviously, like, there's a lot of trauma going on there. But he writes these fictionalized things and seems to process things better by writing fictionalized experiences. And then I mentioned the author Brian Van Riet at the beginning, who is a veteran of Iraq. And he told me when I was talking to him that he he tried writing memoir at first, and in the U.S. we have a lot of support for these veterans writing programs, and he got an MFA and was trying to write memoir, and that just didn't work for him. And then the thing that worked was writing a novel set in Iraq during the time that he was there, but with fictional protagonists, and the main character was actually a woman. And somehow changing from writing about a man to writing about a woman made it possible for him to kind of process what he'd done and describe his experiences. So again, I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't want to prescribe anything, but writing and actually like having the courage to reach out and share your experiences and have faith that people will understand what you've been through, and feel and discovering that you're not alone, seems to be very healing. And then a number of people have said that like sports and manual labor, also something that really connects you with your body, seems to be very healing.
That's actually a really great segue to the next question we received from Jenny Kaminer. So she says, first off, thank you for this fascinating talk. And you focused on psychological trauma in the project, in the book project. And so she's curious if any of these authors deal explicitly with the bodily experience and trauma of war, and how significant would you say corporeality is for these authors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, we'll go through all four of the authors quickly. Polikovskaya, she's talking about other people's experiences, although she does sometimes talk about her own experiences, like the experience of the mock execution. And she's very focused on the corporeal experiences of her interviewees and the physical hardship of the Chechen refugees that she's talking to. And she goes into depth about like they don't have water, they don't have shelter, they're sick. And she describes, elderly people who are suffering from severe illness and just living in a refugee camp. And she describes that very explicitly. So she's largely interested in physical problems, but then she kind of expands it out into like, this is what's happening to our nation as a whole. This is what's happening to our national psyche or our national soul. Um, Eldon, he did experience pretty severe damage when he was captured. He was shot, he was beaten, he was subjected to stress positions, burned with cigarettes, um, needles under the fingernails. And I have a particular aversion to fingernail-based torture, so I had a hard time dealing with that passage. But anyway, which he describes, but it's sort of like he was so out of it that he has a really hard time understanding what was happening to him. But he later in the book, he doesn't deal so much with the aftermath of that, but when I've talked to him on a number of occasions, he's described again the ongoing issues he's had as a result of the brain damage that he experienced for that. And then Babchenko very much focuses on the physical experiences of being in a war zone, and he focuses a lot on the physical experiences of what it's like between battles. So just when you're not actually in combat. And he starts off, the first book in the English language translation of One Soldier's War, because each translation is a little bit different, but the first story in it is called Mountain Brigade, and it's just a list of all the things that you have to carry up into the mountains to go into this post that they've been assigned to in the mountains, and like how painful it is to carry all of that. And throughout it, he's very much focused on hunger and minor injuries and thirst and fatigue and just the real physical experience of it. And then then the psychological trauma comes later. And then Prilepin, also his character Yegor, is very much focused on physical experiences. And there's a lot that's psychological, but again, Prilepin is a very sort of physical writer, and that there's a lot of physicality in the book. So while I focus on psychological trauma, a lot of that is conveyed in the books through physical experience and physical sensations.
Thank you. We have a question from Michelle Rifkin-Fish. First of all, thanks for a fascinating presentation, important book. She asked if you can say a bit more about gender for these authors, and specifically, she's interested in the seeming paradox in which Prilepin both portrays himself as macho, but also discusses great anxiety before going into combat. And how does masculinity get constructed and dealt with in Prilepin's writing, and maybe also, if you see that in the others' writing as well?
Yeah, so Prilepin is maybe the most paradoxical and interesting, but all of them deal explicitly with gender. So Polikovskaya, just really quickly, she is very much a woman in a man's world, and she presents herself as that way. And she's saying this is a feminine perspective on a man's, on man's business, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to critique it from a female perspective, and talk about how this is affecting women and children. And then Eldon has this, he has a lot less about gender, but he does have this kind of like code of the warrior and what it means to be a real man and a good Chechen, that comes up a couple times in the works, and how this sort of and then these kind of somewhat idealized female figures, who are the good and pure woman supporting her man. And so that shows up sometimes in the works. It's not a major feature, but it's definitely there. Babchenko is really interesting, because he he definitely like portrays himself as he is a man. He portrays himself a man. It's very masculine sort of portrayal in a way, but he's also very feminine. Like the young Babchenko in the early stories is very feminized. He was only 19, no experience of war, thrown into this horrific situation. And one of the things that he experiences is potential sexual violence. And we know that that was a huge issue with the Russian military at that time. And so he has this sort of like the young naive Babchenko is portrayed in this very kind of feminine fashion, and goes through this. I talk about how he has this. He's kind of living the Persephone myth, except that he's not Persephone because he's a man, and only in his work only actual women can fully live the Persephone myth, that men like him get trapped in the underworld and they can't make it out. And he does have this scene where he's having a flashback nightmare and his wife pulls him out. And so he very much has women, in the form of his wife, as healers and saviors pulling him out of the underworld while he's trapped down in the underworld, in war. And then with Prilepin, and macho-ness, it's really interesting. I mean, yes, he presents himself and his characters as very macho, but he just really likes to delve into the psychology and be very sort of honest about feelings. And if that includes anxiety, that includes anxiety. He constructs how he constructs masculinity. I mean, that's sort of interesting, that the character Yegor never constructs masculinity. He keeps trying to sort of figure out femininity. So I guess his construction of masculinity is whatever is not feminine. And he and the other male characters spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is feminine and what women are thinking and what it means to be female. And what is masculine is sort of like what's ever left over, something like that. And so it's kind of like what he's doing is just kind of natural and automatic, and I guess that's what it means to be a man. And then they spend a lot of time thinking about, well, but what does it mean to be a woman? And the other thing I'd say about it is that he's very sort of attached to his masculinity, and he has this whole discussion, which is very honest, saying like, I always thought of women as some kind of Christmas decoration or some kind, because New Year's Yulechka decoration, as this kind of special, beautiful thing that was made just for me, but it never could occur to me that they had like their own internal state and were like their own person. They were just like a beautiful toy. And like a child, I would thoughtlessly destroy the beautiful thing that had been given to me, which is very like honest description of what he does. That doesn't necessarily stop him from doing it. And he, a big part of his healing in the book is how he has to kind of become reconciled with his memories of his girlfriend, become reconciled with a female dog, become reconciled with, survive immersion in water, just this feminine force. And so it's basically, he has to learn to deal with the feminine elements of the world without either being destroyed by them or destroying them, which up until then, he mostly destroyed them or felt like he was in terrible danger from them. And then he kind of survives this immersion in water and is baptized by it, and then rescues a female dog and kind of has some kind of reconciliation with what you might call the feminine element, and is able to coexist with it without, like I said, destroying it or being destroyed by it.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question from Ainsley Morris about related to gender. She's curious about political affiliations. You had mentioned Politkovskaya's civilian female focus on the collateral damage side of war. And Ainsley wonders, do you have any examples of men or combatants who also deny any validity to warfare, or do they always kind of end up aligning themselves with large-scale political aims that end up justifying military activity?
I can't think of any examples of male authors or male veterans that I've talked to who deny any validity to warfare. I mean, I'm sure they are out there. And I guess I'd say I'm sure if I delved more deeply into, sort of the Buddhism that was part of my personal life and the engaged Buddhism of Thich Nhat Hanh, I'm sure we would find more examples of that. But for the people who write about war and their experiences of war, like they still feel this strong affiliation with war. And so far, I've mostly seen them as saying like they can't lose that association with war, and they can't seem to see a way around conflict that doesn't necessarily involve war. So I actually have this rather pessimistic view of that. That doesn't mean that it's inevitable, but I do think that it's really hard for people to break out of that trauma once they've experienced it. And that a lot of the times, once you get caught up in that cycle of trauma and abuse, you just keep recreating it. And it's also really hard, I think, for people who've experienced the war machine to envision any solution to it that doesn't involve just a bigger, stronger war machine. And Ainsley, as far as the rest of your question, does that not matter so much for my interest in the depiction of trauma? I'm really interested now in my current research on trying to see if it's possible to write war stories that don't support war. I'm pretty pessimistic about that, to be honest. But I am looking for ways, like, is it possible to write about war or to process trauma without encouraging more war? And also, Ainsley, I also remember that, yes, Bob Chinko was very supportive of the Serbs as well, I guess, and just, a real colorful character. You remember his visit too.
I see that we're at 1:16, and I know that we're scheduled right until 1:30, and that might mean that we have time for maybe one more question, maybe two. I'm not sure if folks do have a final question for Elena. I guess I can also ask, because you're saying your next project. I am curious, are you looking at Russophone literature for this project as well? Have you or are you looking at a different area?
Yeah, so my next project was inspired by this project and particularly by two things. One, Bob Chinko saying that he set off for the first Chechen War with a copy of Remark in his pocket, super excited to be having these wonderful adventures that have been described in like All Quiet on the Western Front, and then Prilyapin saying as he was sitting in the war zone on the Donbass, like, war is when you're really alive, like that's where real life is, and this idea of being drawn to war and being inspired to go to war by works that were supposed to make you anti-war. So I'm looking at that and like how you might write an actual anti-war story. And at the moment that I'm comparing Russophone and Anglophone works. So looking, and I'm really interested in Alexievich, Svetlana Alexievich's writing, where she explicitly said at the beginning of The Unwomanly Face of War that she wants to write a work that will make no one ever want to go to war again. And I actually have an article arguing that she does do a good job of writing an anti-war work, but then I had male students tell me like, no, The Unwomanly Face of War is also a pro-war work, and we want to go make war after reading it. So that's interesting, although a little alarming. And then I'm also looking at Anglophone works like The Lord of the Rings, which is also a really interesting work where Tolkien wanted to write, a kind of a Jesus figure and a gospel kind of inspired work, and an anti-war work. And of course, he experienced World War I, but he can't really come up with an alternative to it. Again, it's kind of depressing that way. But he tries to, but he struggles to come up with an alternative to war. And of course, the movies, in particular of The Lord of the Rings, are really pro-war in a way, although great movies, but still. So I'm looking in my next project, like I said, at comparing Russophone and Anglophone works. So it's bigger, more comparative.
Thank you. So I guess last call for any other questions in the chat. And if I don't see one, I really just, thank you so much again, Elena, for this fascinating talk and for bringing, this book alive. I had read it already myself, but I feel like seeing and hearing you present on it has really brought it home in a way that just me alone in my office reading it didn't quite do. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and thanks also to the author for willing to be on.
Yeah. If anyone has any questions for Mikhail Eldin, he's on standby apparently. So last call for questions to Mikhail as well. And I will give a shout out to him. He's been incredibly helpful throughout the process. And if anyone is interested in his work or wants to find out more about sort of the Chechen side of the Chechen Wars or Chechen literature, I'm sure he'd be very happy to help you out.
Fran, is there anything else we should add?
Just a big thank you to Elena. This was fascinating.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored and delighted to be here. So thank everyone for coming.
Great.
They took away the clapping
Oh.
emoji, so